Today's video contains big spoily boys for Final Fantasy VII Remake. If you don't want to be spoiled, complete the game and then come back. You have been warned. Also, today's video has been sponsored by BenQ. Final Fantasy VII Remake's first game was undoubtedly an excellent one. It delivered on most of its fronts, and for the most part, the game knocked it out of the park. And the series is on track to be fantastic. That being said, there is still plenty of room to improve the formula that they've created, and the hope is that the next game will take things to the next level. In Final Fantasy VII Remake 2, we hope to see the town of Calm, a beautiful Cosmo Canyon, and the Gold Saucer, alongside many other locations. That being said, these improvements are based on what I view as either flaws or things that are currently good but could be even better. And with that out of the way, how can we make a Final Fantasy VII Remake Game 2 that knocks it out of the park even further than this first game? First and foremost, I think it's important to address one of the issues that would break my immersion at times. Despite being a somewhat minor issue in the grand scheme of things, it's still an issue that shouldn't be there. That of course being the issue with the LODs, level of details, and textures that would pop in during the game. On occasion, during these cutscenes, I would literally see objects loading in more polygons and textures loading in as the scene would play out. This was also apparent during gameplay as well. And what's more apparent is just how horrendously low resolution some of these textures are in the game. When you're supposed to be looking at a massive city below you or the view of a plate collapse in the distance, you are literally able to see just how compressed the image is. In my review of the game, I found this issue to be so glaring that I was under the assumption that it would have been fixed with a day one patch. And considering that a recent patch for Final Fantasy XIV was delayed due to the current pandemic, it's very possible that they did have this patch in the works, but they weren't able to put it out. So that's a possibility. But right now, we honestly don't know. The reason behind this, some say, is the Unreal Engine 4 or the PS4 simply getting older, but under scrutiny, those statements just don't hold up. Not only do other games using Unreal Engine 4, including ones made by Square Enix, like Kingdom Hearts 3 and Dragon Quest XI, not have this issue, but also in multiple areas of the game, such as Chapter 2 or Shinra HQ, this is a complete non-issue. I don't know if the slums just can't afford better textures or what. So the engine and the hardware are capable of achieving the desired performance. This has led some people to suggest that this is a storage issue with the game already being 2 full Blu-ray discs in capacity, which is fine, but that's also a super easy issue to solve by putting an option for an HD texture pack for download on PlayStation Network. In terms of world design, Final Fantasy VII Remake's first game was fairly linear. I generally quite enjoy linear games, and found that the linear structure of this game was probably the best way to faithfully retell the story of Midgar, which was linear in the original game. With that said, I think we all have some expectations set by the original game that since we are going to be going to major areas like Calm and Cosmo Canyon, that we'll be traversing large amounts of land. With that said, it's likely we won't be seeing the traditional world map of yore in this game, but instead something modern. As I mentioned in a previous video, I believe they'll go the Dragon Quest XI route for modernizing the world map. Dragon Quest XI features very large zones, not too dissimilar to the way Final Fantasy XII does things. And considering that these are both Unreal Engine 4 games, it makes sense that they would approach it in the same sense. Not to mention that open world games are extremely time-consuming and very expensive to make, and they have to keep making these Final Fantasy VII Remake games back to back. Thus, I believe that zones will be the best option both for players and for the developers themselves, allowing them to give the open world feel without paying the open world tax. And speaking of world design, with that said, one of my biggest issues with the first remake game is some of the more obvious padding that you run into. Generally, there were a number of dungeons that were made way longer than they should have been, and would have been way more enjoyable if they were more concise. Though I cannot think of a bigger offender of this than the main story quest of Chapter 14, which sees you backtracking through the sewers again, chasing a monster that stole your key, and fighting Abzu for the second time. Though on the plus side, at least they did switch the fight up a little bit. That being said, I really enjoy many of the game's new story additions, such as breaking into Jessie's parents' house and robbing her sick and injured father. Listen, it's not as bad as it sounds, I promise. promise. The reason the moment resonates so much more with me than, say, the second Abzu fight is because of how much substance it adds to the character as a whole without having to make me trek back through a dungeon I've already completed and refight the same boss. One game and yet two polar opposite examples of how to properly handle new content in a massive expansion that is this remake. My hope is that Final Fantasy VII Remake Game 2's world and character expansions are like that of the excellence surrounding Jesse's character in the first game. Side quests in this game, in my view, were more worth doing than they were in Final Fantasy 13 and 15, and in my view were a step up in general. The side quests in this game are absolutely worth doing, and they even influence some of the stuff that happens in the main game, such as the ability to unlock the best dresses in Wall Market. They were at their best when they felt like they were linked to the lore of the world, or fleshed out side characters, and at their worst when they were go here and kill X monster. That said, there is a certain sense of satisfaction from go here and kill X monster grind, which can very easily be divided into hunts. Like we've seen with such games as Final Fantasy 15, the addition of hunts, especially in a game that should be physically bigger in terms of space, should help fill all that landmass with something to do. It would also resolve one of the bigger complaints about the first game, being that there really isn't too much post-game content outside of replaying the game on hard mode and doing the VR missions. And I would also hope that side quests would not be chapter locked like they are in this game. However, one area of the game that I view as close to perfect is the game's combat system. I honestly do not have much to complain about here, but there are some grievances that I think should be addressed. The biggest one is that you can unleash some of your most powerful attacks and then be interrupted by a boss cutscene you didn't know was going to happen. One of the easy ways to solve this from a developer perspective is to not have your MP or limit gauge drain whenever your attack triggers a boss cutscene. Another easy way to fix it is to have the HP bar segmented so that the player knows when the next phase is coming. I figured I would also mention that some people hate losing their ATB bars when they're interrupted. Personally, I don't mind it at all, as it forces the player to learn the openings of when to properly attack and cast magic. Though one thing I can say personally peeves me is when I lose MP on a failed cast, which I can find particularly annoying on hard mode where enemies are seemingly more aggressive. There's a lot of people who've had complaints about issues with AI or the charging of ATB when you're not actively playing as that character. I actually strongly disagree with most of these assessments, and I usually find the critiques to come from a lack of understanding how the flow of the game's combat is actually meant to work. They want you to constantly be switching between these characters, that's actually the whole point. Combat that felt like it was too automated was the biggest complaint of Final Fantasy XII, Final Fantasy 13, and Final Fantasy 15. And from my view, I personally view this system where you're actively controlling everyone and micromanaging every little detail to be the better system. That being said, I still don't see any harm in integrating some type of command to suggest your party members' AI play more defensively, focus on healing, something like that. Or maybe even something similar to the Gambit system from Final Fantasy XII that doesn't quite do everything for you. Then there's the part you've all been waiting for, the story. Here's where things get somewhat tedious to critique. Based on everything that we know so far, I feel fairly confident that Final Fantasy VII Remake Game 2 will mostly be a remake of Final Fantasy VII in the same fashion that this first game was. That being said, there is definitely a brand new overarching story, which many people are speculating involves timelines and possibly multiverses. That being said, I hope they strike a good balance between ambitious changes and that which makes Final Fantasy VII what it is. If they do end up going down the multiverse route, please do not have ridiculous situations like two versions of the same cloud existing in different universes interacting, or have weird situations like Zack, who is implied to be alive by the Ultimania, crossing over into the canon timeline and interacting with our heroes. That would honestly be weird and somewhat upsetting, as it would kind of undermine some of the central deaths in Final Fantasy VII. I know that the developers want to keep the original game and compilation relevant in their own right. However, if you're going to continue to introduce these elements, I ask Square that you do so in a newcomer-friendly manner. Many of the newcomers I knew you who played this first game didn't quite know who Zack was, or only had a vague idea. The same with Sephiroth. A lot of these story beats relied on you knowing the original game, which a lot of people picking up this remake not only as their entry to Final Fantasy VII, but maybe their entry to Final Fantasy certainly did not. And while seeing Zack or fighting Sephiroth might have been considered a big payoff for longtime fans, for many new people hoping to get into FF7, these were just points of confusion. Also, we fought Sephiroth at the end of this first game, so please don't rehash this fight and create a situation where we had to refight him at the end of each game. I say this in particular because we've already had a taste of the main villain now, and now anything that isn't him could be perceived as a step down. The question now becomes, how do they keep escalating these fights in each game, especially when you've already had a taste of the biggest bad guy? It'll be tough, but I'm dying to see what happens. With all of this said though, Final Fantasy VII Remake's first entry has been absolutely stellar, and for the most part has gotten the series off to a good start. The challenges of the second game to be bigger and better loom overhead. I offer these critiques with hopes that Square Enix will hear us out and try their hardest to make an even better game than the last, and I honestly have faith that they'll be able to pull it off. And I would love if you leave a comment below telling me what improvement you'd like to see in the next game of Final Fantasy VII Remake over this first one. And with that said, now a word from today's sponsor, BenQ. If you've been enjoying playing Final Fantasy VII Remake, then you should try playing it on a screen the size of your wall. And thanks to the BenQ TH685 console gaming projector, you can play at 1080p with low latency, featuring 8 millisecond low input lag for smooth gaming and better performance. It also has HDR support with 10,000 to 1 contrast as well as a game mode. It also has high brightness at 3500 LM, making your content look great even in bright rooms. With Lumi Expert, it automatically adjusts the brightness to your surrounding for optimized images every time. The 15,000 hour lamp life lasts so long that it helps you save money and the effort that you go through with bulb replacement. The TH685 also has its own incredible built-in speaker, which enables you to have a much more immersive audio-visual experience than ever. Honestly, firing this projector up and playing some FF7R on it is a great experience. And if you're curious where to get one, there's a link in the description below.